Hey, Risto Martin here with George Mason University. We're talking to Dr. Doug Gleddie today, and the discussion will be on social media as a tool for professional development. If you're on social media, you probably know Doug. He's got a great blog. He's active on Twitter. He's got a really practitioner-focused delivery of content on social media, so he's a great person to have on the podcast to talk about this issue. And so here we go with another episode of Playing with Research in Health and Physical Education. All right, we're here with Dr. Doug Gleddie from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. Today we're discussing his chapter that was published in a recent book by Ash Casey, Vicky Goodyear, and Kathy Armour. The title of the chapter is Joey, Social Media as a Tool for Professional Development. So welcome to the podcast, and thanks for taking the time to chat about your paper.
Hey, thanks, Risto. It's great. And by the way, I absolutely love the title of your podcast. The idea of playing with research is pretty much what I've been doing my whole career. So I love that title. And first off, I'd really like to thank the co-authors of this article as well as the editors. It was a real fun piece to work with. I will admit it was having that many authors a little bit like herding cats, but all of them, Joey, David, Hakan, Lorraine, and Ash, were all fabulous to work with. So
awesome. So who is Joey?
Yeah, and as you said in your intro, if you're on social media and you're a phys ed person, you're going to know Joey. And he was okay with being kind of outed in the textbook, for lack of a better term, or not the textbook, in the book chapter. Joey is a physical education teacher in Montreal, Canada, who's been in the phys ed world for, I think probably he's been teaching for 8 to 10 years now, maybe not quite that long. But he's really embraced the technology side of things. He's been very active on Twitter and in various forms of social media. So he runs the physicaleducator.com, which is a pretty high-level resource. Lots of good stuff on there. So that's who he is.
Awesome. And I know that when you said that he kind of got outed in this chapter, I was reading it going, wow. He's really putting himself out there and letting people really critique and comment on his pedagogy, which I think it's brave for sure, and I think we all kind of will learn a lot from his experience. So what does Joey do with social media?
I don't know that there's much that Joey doesn't do with social media, really. He very much, he's involved on Twitter. He uses Google Scholar to find research. He's got YouTube connections in terms of using YouTube. Skype, like we're chatting on right now. I've had a Skype with Joey. Lots of Google Forms and folders and that. And I know he's got some presence on Facebook, but I think the main piece is Twitter, and then of course, whether websites are considered social media or not, I think they're a way of, when you post on Twitter that you've got a blog post or you've got a new resource up, it's that interconnection of the social media work we have now with all things technology. So there's a lot of social media technology use.
Awesome. And so what does Joey describe his professional learning community as, and how does that help him?
Yeah, and as he mentions in the chapter about kind of the weight of responsibility, but also the joy of having like 20,000 plus followers, because when you put a question out there, you put a thought out there, there's lots of people that can respond. And so I think there's, he doesn't necessarily say it explicitly in the article, but there's a big picture social media piece in terms of a PLN where there's this huge network of people that any one of them can respond at any time, day or night, to something put out there. But then there's also, I think all of us kind of have those subgroups when we kind of look for replies from certain people, or we might send out a request and query certain Twitter addresses so that we can, kind of tailor things to where we want. And Joey's no different. He does that as well. And he has people that he follows up with further based on the initial response from social media.
Now, how did that use of social media translate to his pedagogy?
Yeah, and the example he used in his portion of the chapter was, um, he wanted to look at how to scaffold things, and specifically in a sending, receiving, or sorry, a striking, fielding unit with grade 6 students. And so he was kind of looking at how do I scaffold some skills and tactics and an idea. And so he got a lot of responses initially. Did some reflecting, and then he ended up connecting with a teacher in California, Terry Drain, who's also pretty active on Twitter, and ended up, I think he watched a YouTube video of some of her backwards by design stuff. Then he ended up meeting her at a conference and had a face-to-face discussion. He had Skype conversations with Dean Dudley from Australia, and various other people. So I think what I really see it as, it's almost like a funnel where you start with all this broad information, and then when you're narrowing it down, eventually you're getting to the point of connecting with people through, they may be social media directed venues or media pieces, but it's a more intentional, targeted piece.
Right. And so you look at these, or his narrative really through first the elementary physical education, teacher education, and then you through Foucauldian and then anthropological perspectives. So let's start with the piece that you wrote specifically in this chapter, and which is through the elementary Pete perspective. How did you see Joey's narrative from the view of Pete faculty member?
Yeah, absolutely. The first piece is there's different. I mean, there's different types and different definitions of what an elementary phys ed teacher is. In our program here, we don't have a specialist program for phys ed. So our teachers are elementary generalist teachers, and they take a curriculum and pedagogy course for phys ed with me. They can take up to 2 courses. And so it's a little bit of a different animal. Someone like Joey, who had specific phys ed training, he sees himself as a phys ed teacher. The pre-service teachers that I work with don't always see themselves as phys ed teachers. They see themselves as teachers. And that may not be at first a real important distinction, but I talk about this in the book a little bit, but my philosophy with my students is number one about value. I need to get them to value the fact and get them to a point of valuing physical education as part of whole child education, holistic education. Once I'm there, the next step is identity. And that identity piece is, do you see yourself as a teacher of physical education? Because there's a lot of elementary teachers who feel that, oh, that's for jocks or athletes. I can't do that. And so getting them to have that identity. Once we get through value and identity, then we can get to pedagogy. So what I bring up in the chapter is a little bit about the idea that if I don't have them there, I'm not going to blast them with all this stuff on Twitter because they're going to be overwhelmed. So it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose a little bit, but I also have to make sure that they want to have a drink. That metaphor is going horribly awry, but that's okay.
No, I hear you loud and clear, because when I taught at Cal State Fullerton, I taught 2 types of classes, and one of them was an elementary methods class exactly like yours. So you have generalist teachers that come in, and you really have to sell the value of what you're trying to teach before getting into pedagogy. So we were lucky to then also have an elementary methods class that we started moving towards just having for physical education undergraduate students who are learning how to teach elementary. And because we had them intermixed, and it was tough to get to the real deep pedagogy. And I could see that if you go in one of those classes and start talking about Twitter use and being super ingrained, it would be tough.
Yeah, and even just throwing around, TGFU or TPSR and starting to just throw those around, the people who have a phys ed background might have some steeping in that curricular knowledge. The elementary generalists don't. So it's a time piece. It's picking and choosing what are the most critical elements. That being said, I do believe that if you connect people with social media and with some of the, I'll say, right people on social media, And I say that with a little bit of hesitation, but it is a resource that can continue to be there long after they're out of my class.
Yeah, absolutely. And so your second perspective was through Foucault, and let's take a deep dive into Land of Foucault here. I know your co-author Håkan Larsson covered this section, but can you explain to begin who is Foucault and what's his major theory?
Yeah, I mean, mostly Foucault is known as the kind of philosopher of power, the idea that all our relationships are infused with power, and the power dynamic is there everywhere. It's not just top down; it's infused throughout. So, and I'll be the first to admit I'm not a Foucauldian scholar. I have been on some student Foucauldian committees. I work with a professor over in kinesiology, sport and rec, who takes a Foucauldian approach to coaching. And although I love the conversations, there are times when I am just completely lost. But Hakan did a really good job of kind of focusing in on some of the power dynamics, and really, like, he writes that Foucault's perspective is about self-understanding, and it's how we understand ourselves as human beings and our conduct. So how do we behave in the social world, which is a great kind of preliminary piece to that idea of social media, because that's the whole, we human beings are social beings, and social media is another iteration from sitting around the fire in a cave somewhere. Now we sit around a screen on Facebook or Twitter. So Hakan really unpacks some of those pieces of power and privilege. Even the idea of Joey saying he wants to push teachers to be their best. What's his right to push? And how does he provide the opportunity to judge people to be pushed? And I will insert here again, and you mentioned this already, that I'm super impressed with Joey putting himself out there, because that was part of the process, and we were having conversations writing this chapter. After he read all of our pieces and reflected on them, like, I had a conversation with Joey, and he said it was really hard, but it was really rewarding to put yourself out there, to kind of be hammered from these three different perspectives. And the purpose was not to rip Joey apart. The purpose was to question. And that's really what Foucault does a lot too, is in terms of questioning things. So it's not that technology is a bad thing, but we need to consider the unintended consequences. So the other things that Hakan brought out was the idea of there was a little bit of the culture coming from. Agency was in there in terms of, Joey's kind of a big player on Twitter in a way. So what agency does that come with? And then, no technology is culturally neutral. What are certain norms and values that fit in that culture?
Yeah, and I think that when you talked about agency, I think there are some major players on Twitter just because of how many followers they are, or having a website, and there definitely is that power dynamic there. So, is there anything else you wanted to add about how Foucault relates to Joey?
I think one of the pieces, and I know we'll probably touch on this later, but well, I know we will, because it's in the it's in the conclusion. But the idea that, do you have to use social media, or do you have to use technology to be a good citizen? And I'm using air quotes around good citizen, but is that expected? Can you be a good teacher without using technology? Now, I would say yes, you can. It's a tool. So those ideas of this inherent kind of power dynamic of, if you use technology, you're inherently perceived, even the whole hashtag of PE geeks, it almost, it's this, oh, I'm a PE geek, I'm this upper level. And I don't think that's what people have intended with it. But if we don't question these things, we never question these things.
Yeah, and I think that this chapter does a really good job using Joey as somebody that we kind of question. And the third perspective you took was the anthropological perspective that was covered by David Howe. Can you give us an overview of what that was?
Yeah, that was the one that I found. I mean, I really enjoyed the other ones as well, but looking at it from a kind of a cultural and ethnographic idea, the idea that schools are places of culture, The phys ed world is a place of culture. Therefore, any professional learning network, any Twitter group is a cultural place, and there are cultural norms. And so David brings up the idea of that. The vast majority of the people who are kind of the people on Twitter, or even the people they come from a Western methodological or a Western philosophical background, and we often don't stop and recognize that, to take a moment of where they're at. David brings up, I think one of the most important thing is the idea of context. So where you're teaching, who are the children that you're teaching? So Joey teaches in a pretty high-end neighborhood. It certainly would be upper-end middle class. So these are kids who, and that impacts everything from their skill development outside of school to their access to sport and recreation outside of school, but it also applies to them being perhaps part of a dominant culture. And so we need to consider that as we're looking at where we're going. And again, David touches on the idea of the privilege of access to technology. Not everyone has this access. And, I distinctly, this is not in the chapter at all, but years ago, I took a group of students down to Ecuador to work with some schools down there, schools with a high percentage of orphaned kids and things like that. And after the first day, we were sitting around and the students were really critiquing the teacher. Oh man, this is not good pedagogy, and this teacher's not doing a good job. And I just asked the students to stop, and I said, listen, are any of you certificated teachers at this point in time? No. Have any of you taught in Ecuador at this school? No. So we have to just be open and receptive. This teacher has been teaching in the school for 10 years. We can't come in there and tell them everything's wrong. That's not, it has no respect for culture. It has no respect for context. So, and not that Joey was disrespectful at all. He's not. But we need to consider the context. If I'm sharing all about my experiences in a middle class school, that could be very different from someone in an inner city school, for someone in a school across the world.
Yeah. And I think that there is a lot to that. I've worked with both student teachers and teachers in, more of the inner city schools versus more of the affluent schools. And, some of the stuff that you see on Twitter, you just can't implement in certain contexts. And there is that kind of power. And I think we had a conversation with Harvey about his Twitter paper that just got released. So we talk about in that podcast too about how teachers oftentimes put the best of the best out there. So they show what they're doing really well, but we're not having that conversation of, actually showing how we're failing. So it's a little bit of a twisted reality in a way. But so your final perspective is the pedagogical perspective, and this section was written by you, Lorraine Kale, and Ash Casey. And you essentially apply a pedagogical lens to the three perspectives we just covered. So how does Joey align with this concept of power and Foucault's concept of constant checking?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just that idea of continuing, continually looking at the process of power dynamics. And are we limited by culture? Are we limiting or excluding other types of cultures? And that's a kind of a little c culture. Like we just mentioned, is it a culture of middle class? Is it white middle class? Is it somehow we look at China? Like, there is no one embracing culture other than the human culture, which is incredibly diverse. So it's just constantly questioning, did what I do meet the needs of my kids? Was I receptive and sensitive to the context? Did I allow for other perspectives other than the dominant Western culture to emerge and Western perspective to emerge? And what did I do actively and passively to make that happen? So I think, the concept of power went all the way through. And, as we talked about before, this kind of idea of being a big name. And I know we moved and Stephen Harvey talked about this in his chapter too, but we kind of start out in professional learning network on Twitter, and we share all the good things. But eventually you maybe get more comfortable, or maybe you feel like, well, I now have enough power or credibility on Twitter that now I can share some mistakes because people won't judge me for it because they've seen all the good stuff that I do. Right. So there's a balance there as well of checking those pieces.
Yeah, and another interesting concept that you brought up in the chapter was that kind of like the view of our world, even through Twitter, is this Westernized view. And you bring up Rossi's book from 2015. Can you elaborate on that worldview?
Yeah, a little bit in terms of, and the biggest point I think they make there is that schools are not a place of neutrality. There are cultural norms that are developed, and let's face it, our world that we deal in right now has been hugely influenced by Western philosophy, Western thoughts, Western practice. That's the dominant view all the way over. Doesn't mean it's the only view. And we don't talk about worldviews enough. So what does an Eastern worldview look like? What does an atheist worldview look like? There's all sorts of ways to go through this, and schools are places where this happens. And I think the most important piece of that is the idea of, I mean, not the most important piece, but the most relevant piece to this chapter is when we put technology in a place of primacy, in a place of privilege, what does that mean for those who can't access it? What does that mean? We're just assumed, oh, well, use this app for your phys ed class. Well, 80% of my students don't have a mobile device. Right. Or they have one that's so old that it doesn't update to the apps.
Yeah.
Or my school is inner city and we can't afford all this stuff. Or my school is middle class and we can't keep up with all the technological advances.
Right. Or you're assigning things that need Wi-Fi access at home. And yes, the student has Wi-Fi access at school, but when they get home, they don't. And it's this concept that sometimes I think people forget, right? They just make that assumption of just go home and get online. Well, that doesn't actually work.
No, and I also wonder, Risto, in terms of, and I've played with this with my own students too, but is phys ed the place where we should focus less on technology because it's so focused everywhere else? We have an opportunity for kids to be face-to-face, hand-to-hand, arm-in-arm. And maybe we need to make sure we keep that. And if we have too much technology in phys ed, and I've actually, in my own teaching of my pre-service teachers, I pulled back on, I do talk about technology and I share what we can use it for, but I also talk about the benefits of phys ed being perhaps the one place where kids can drop that technology and they can actually talk and interact and solve problems with each other face to face.
Right. I think in the chapter, your last pedagogical approach was super interesting to me, and you talked about how there might be this power dynamic, and we alluded to that earlier, of our culture becoming more and more technology driven, and the tech savvy teacher may end up influencing others and being in a higher position of power. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, so I think what we struggle with in the last bit of that portion of the chapter is that, to some extent, because of even though there are barriers to accessing technology, there are less barriers now than ever before. I've spent some time in countries in the developing world, and actually the cellular phones are more used there than they are here in Canada, and the rates are way the heck cheaper. Yeah. But it, so we could look at Joey as, hey, this could be any of us. This could be anybody. We can have that access. You can be anybody and have that profile on Twitter. But are we privileging people? Like, are teachers who use technology cooler than teachers who don't? I saw someone posted a picture on Twitter of a mug, and it's great. It was like phys ed teacher definition, the same as any other teacher except for cooler. And I think we could do a similar thing, hashtag PE geek or hashtag phys ed geek, just like a regular phys ed teacher, but cooler. And I don't know that we want to go there. I think we want to acknowledge that technology has its purpose and role, but it's not the only thing that's there.
Right. So kind of in a summary.
Uh, yeah, in summary, I think for Joey, like he has used social media and his professional learning network to his advantage, but I don't think he is controlled by or driven by technology. That's a conclusion there. And he is also contextually focused. He gathers things that impact his students at his school, and he's quick to share that as well. He acknowledges he works at a private school. He acknowledges those things, but at the same time, even though he has, he's Western based in his perspective and that kind of thing, he works his butt off, and he is honest, and he wants to share. He's willing to share his mistakes as well as his successes. So there's an authenticity there, that really shone through despite our critique and our kind of hammering on Joey for a little bit. That authenticity and really the desire to be the best teacher he can be for the purpose of his students. He's not the best teacher he can be so that his Twitter followers go up. He's the best teacher he can be for his students.
Right. And I think that there is something there of saying, yes, he does work in a more affluent area, but he's still doing a good job. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with him like going the extra mile and working really hard to be a really good teacher. So when I was reading this, because it started with the introduction and then kind of a critique by the three different ways, and I started thinking, oh man, are we gonna hear from Joey? Like, is he gonna have a rebuttal here? And so you do have this piece. So what did Joey have to say about these academics, you included, breaking down his teaching?
Well, we did have to edit out a lot of Joey's swearing at us in here. He was, but no, like I mentioned before, he was very appreciative of the opportunity, and it was a little bit raw at first, but I know, and I think this was a design from Ash, Vicky, and Kathy, but we couldn't have done this without having Joey have the last word, so to speak, because it really is about the case. And the idea of these pedagogical cases is it's not meant to be because most cases, I think the idea of case study goes back to law, and you look at a case in law and you try and here's a problem and we're going to solve it. That was not our perspective here. Joey was not a problem that we're trying to solve through a Foucauldian, anthropological, and elementary phys ed perspective. Joey was a case for the purpose of examining a case. And let's look at it from different perspectives and see what we can learn from this. And Joey learned that, he has to be considerate of his culture. He learned that he took a hard self-reflective look and said, yeah, one of the reasons I want to be the best teacher I can be is because people make fun of phys ed all the time. And I don't want to be that teacher that just rolls out a ball and plays dodgeball. I want to be a teacher who is thoughtful, who is a pedagogue, who assesses with purpose, all those kind of things. So I really think for Joey, it was an opportunity for introspection that was led to by this considered and I think considerate critique of his work. And he had some reminders about how he shares. And I'll just his last word of his piece, he says, I want to thank all my co-authors in this chapter for helping me see how I might further improve and for being an additional part of my professional learning journey. And I know for me, and I think I can speak for my co-authors, Joey is a part of our professional learning journey as well. We are richer for have had this experience with Joey.
Absolutely. And so what are some things that we can learn from this case?
I think, from the Foucauldian perspective, the idea of power dynamics and that it's not just a top-down thing. These are inherent in all of our relationships and in every aspect of professional development through social media. From the ethnographic piece, the idea of culture, and a term that's used a lot is the other. Who are the other people? And now we talk about othering, so we have to be careful about not over-identifying. But just how do we broaden our networks and make them more authentic? Who do you have in your network? Is it all the same kind of people? When the election happened a few years ago in the States, we talked about these echo chambers of debate. So we don't want to live in an echo chamber. We want to have people who challenge us from different perspectives. From the elementary phys ed perspective, we need to nurture our early career teachers. how can we help them create an authentic view of the profession and help them create their own professional network and to be a little bit discretionary, right? And then just, from the broad technological piece, an online PLN can be very important, but that idea of constant checking, to go back to Foucault again, and reflection, and then just awareness, what is their impact? Who are we reaching when we get out there?
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you on Twitter, social media, your blog? Do you have those off the top of your head?
Yeah, I am at the very innovative and exciting Twitter handle of @Doug_Gleddie. Very innovative. And I do write a blog at purposefulmovement.net, which is lots of fun, and I'm always interested in comments on there. But yeah, I don't use a lot of other social media at this point in time. I am on Voxer a little bit, but not much. Twitter's kind of my main feed there.
Cool, awesome, and we'll link to all these and the citation for the chapter as well, and the book, which is Digital Technologies in Learning and Physical Education, Pedagogical Cases. So it has a bunch of these pedagogical cases in there. So thank you so much for your time. That's all we have on this podcast, and thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Risto.